This all began shortly after I moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood in a small town I had never visited before. I was eager to settle into a new place, craving the kind of peace that only a close-knit community could offer. The streets were lined with modest houses, each with well-kept lawns and porches that suggested neighbors who cared, but there was also a certain stillness, almost a hesitation, that I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of town where everyone seemed to know one another, yet no one rushed to invite you in. I found that both comforting and a little unsettling. The day I arrived, I took a long walk through the neighborhood, wanting to familiarize myself with my new surroundings. Most of the houses were tucked behind blossoming dogwoods and maples, their windows reflecting the soft afternoon light. The people I passed offered polite nods or quick smiles, but nobody stopped to chat for long. In the corner grocery store, the cashier mentioned a few families who had lived there for decades, quietly adding that some neighbors had recently left without much explanation. At first, I thought it was just typical small-town gossip, but it planted a seed of curiosity in me. One neighbor stood out in particular. Mrs. Callahan was an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down from me. She was the kind of person who seemed to embody the spirit of the neighborhood, always tending her flower beds, waving to passers-by, and greeting everyone who crossed her path. On my first morning, she was out watering her roses, her face lined with years of sun and smiles. She welcomed me with a warm, if slightly weary, grin and offered to share some homemade jam. It was the kind of gesture that made me feel, for a moment, like I truly belonged. But then, just days later, Mrs. Callahan was gone. The flowers she so lovingly cared for were left untended, the front door shut tight. I asked around, but no one seemed to know where she had gone or why. It was as if she had simply vanished overnight. There were no signs of packing or moving trucks, no hints or explanations. The mail had begun piling up on her porch, and the gentle hum of her garden sprinkler was silent. It was a subtle but unmistakable absence, like a missing piece in a puzzle no one wanted to complete. As the days passed, I started noticing other houses with similar signs. Lights that never came on after dusk, newspapers stacking up unread, and lawns that had begun to grow wild. It felt eerie, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. I'd catch glimpses of neighbors talking in hushed tones by the fence lines, but whenever I tried to join in or ask questions, the conversation would abruptly stop. There was an unspoken rule not to mention the disappearances, or at least that's how it felt to me. One afternoon, while walking my dog, I passed by the Hendersons' house. They were a young couple with 2 small children who had always seemed lively and cheerful. That day, the front gate was wide open, and the kids' toys were scattered across the yard, untouched. The backyard swing swayed gently in the breeze, but there was no sign of anyone home. I called out softly, but silence answered me. It was the kind of quiet that presses on your chest and makes your skin crawl. I left quickly, glancing back over my shoulder. The more I tried to piece things together, the more the neighborhood felt like a living enigma. I began jotting down notes about which houses showed signs of abandonment and which neighbors I hadn't seen in days. There was a pattern, but it was maddeningly incomplete. No one seemed willing to talk about it openly, and when I brought it up to a few people, I was met with forced smiles and quick excuses. One elderly man, who owned a hardware store nearby, whispered that some folks just up and left, like they got tired of the place. But even he seemed uneasy sharing more. What unsettled me most was that despite the disappearances, the neighborhood didn't seem to change. The streets remained clean, the mailboxes stood upright, and the community center hosted its regular weekly bingo nights, as if nothing was amiss. It was as if the vanished neighbors had been erased from existence, leaving behind only empty shells of homes and unanswered questions. I found myself drawn to the house next door to mine, where a middle-aged couple had lived for years. They were the only ones who had ever invited me inside, offering tea and stories about the town's history. But one evening, when I stopped by to say hello, the porch light was off and the door was locked tight. Their car was gone, and their mailbox was stuffed with unopened letters. I tried calling their number, but it went straight to voicemail. It was the same pattern repeating itself, and with each new silent house, my anxiety grew. That first week, I kept hoping Mrs. Callahan would return or that someone would explain the strange disappearances, but the neighborhood remained shrouded in quiet mystery. I started to feel like an outsider watching a slow unraveling, A place where people simply vanished without a trace, and no one dared to speak of it. It was like living among ghosts. Neighbors who once filled the streets with life now reduced to memories and empty homes. By the time the weekend rolled around, I found myself sitting on my porch well after dark, listening for any signs of life beyond the occasional car passing by. The silence was thick, almost tangible, and I wondered if I was the only one left truly aware of the strange stillness settling over the neighborhood. I thought about reaching out to the police or the town hall, but something held me back. Maybe it was the wary looks I got when I asked innocuous questions, or maybe it was the creeping suspicion that whatever was happening here wasn't something anyone wanted to confront. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that beneath the quiet streets and friendly faces, something was lurking just out of sight. Something that had already taken so many of my neighbors, including the woman who had welcomed me so warmly just days before. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew I had to keep watching, even if it meant standing alone in the shadows of a neighborhood slowly fading away. In the days that followed, the creeping unease I felt about the neighborhood only deepened. I started noticing more and more houses that seemed frozen in time, like snapshots of lives abruptly paused. The mailboxes overflowed with letters and advertisements. The grass in some yards grew untamed, and faded curtains hung unmoved behind dusty windows. It was almost as if the people who lived there had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky painted itself in shades of orange and purple, I walked past the Mitchell's house. Their porch light, which had always glowed softly at night, was darkened completely. I paused, my dog tugging at the leash, and noticed the faint smell of mildew drifting from the cracked open front door. The lawn was strewn with fallen leaves that no one had bothered to rake. A pile of newspapers, yellowed and curling at the edges, sat unattended by the stoop. It was a small, ordinary scene, yet it sent a shiver through me. When I called out tentatively, no answer came, only the rustling of the wind through dead branches. The more I observed, the more I heard whispers. Quiet rumors passed from neighbor to neighbor like reluctant secrets. At the corner cafe, a few locals spoke in low tones about the increasing number of missing residents. Some said they'd heard strange noises at night, soft knocks on doors, footsteps on empty porches, or the faint sound of someone calling out, but no one answering. Others talked about shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, like fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished when looked at directly. I listened, careful not to draw attention to myself, but the fear in their voices was unmistakable. One afternoon, I met Mrs. Green, an older woman who ran a small antique store down the main street. She seemed wary at first, but when I mentioned the disappearances, her eyes darkened. "It's been happening for months," she whispered. "Neighbors just gone. No notes, no warnings. Just empty houses where life once was." She hesitated, then added, "Some folks think it's the work of something that feeds on this place." I smiled uneasily, unsure whether to take her seriously or chalk it up to small-town superstition, but the weight in her voice lingered with me long after I left. Back in my own house, I began noticing subtle signs that something was wrong beyond just the missing people. At night, the silence became oppressive, broken only by occasional creaks and distant, unplaceable sounds. Sometimes, I'd catch the faint scent of something earthy and damp, like freshly turned soil, even though there was no rain. Once, I found a single muddy footprint on my doorstep, though I was certain I'd locked the door that morning. I wiped it away quickly, not wanting to dwell on what it might mean. One evening, as I returned from a trip to the grocery store, I saw a group of neighbors gathered in hushed conversation near the park. They stopped talking as I approached, their faces tight with worry. When I asked what was going on, a man named Paul, who lived a few blocks over, lowered his voice. "Another family disappeared last night," he said grimly. "The Thompsons. Their house was empty this morning. No sign of struggle, nothing." He shook his head. "It's like they just vanished into thin air." Despite these disturbing reports, no official announcements or investigations were underway. The local police seemed to dismiss concerns, attributing the disappearances to people moving away quietly or family disputes. When I called the non-emergency number to report my own observations, like the strange noises and the growing number of empty homes, I was met with polite but unhelpful responses. "We haven't had any reports of missing persons matching those names," the dispatcher told me flatly. "If you have evidence, please come to the station." But when I offered to share my notes and observations, I was encouraged instead to keep an eye on things and report back if anything more concrete happened. It felt like a wall was being built between me and anyone who might help. The community itself seemed caught in a strange limbo. People were disappearing, but the neighborhood carried on as if nothing was wrong. Grocery stores stayed open, kids still played in the park during the day, and the mail continued to be delivered to empty houses. It was as if the entire town was pretending the vanishings weren't happening, or perhaps that acknowledging them would somehow make things worse. One night, restless and unable to sleep, I decided to step outside and walk the block. The streetlights cast long pools of pale light on the pavement, but the shadows between the trees seemed thick and shifting. I passed a few houses where the windows were dark and silent, their front doors shut tight. At one, I thought I heard the faintest creak, like a door slowly opening, but when I stopped and listened closely, there was only the wind. My heart raced, and I hurried away, feeling eyes watching me from the darkness. The next day, I noticed a car parked outside the Jenkins house that hadn't been there before. It was an old sedan, its paint chipped and faded, with no license plate. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. I mentioned it to a neighbor, but she just shrugged and said she hadn't seen anyone new move in. That evening, the car was gone, but the feeling of unease it left stayed with me. Around this time, I also began to see personal belongings left behind in some of the abandoned homes. At the Parker house, there was a child's backpack sitting on the porch, dusty and worn. At the Lewis residence, a bicycle lay toppled in the yard, its chain rusted and tangled. These small, everyday things made the disappearances feel more real and more terrifying. It was as if the people had been pulled away so suddenly that they hadn't even had time to pack a bag or lock their doors. I tried to talk to a few other neighbors about what I was seeing and feeling, but the responses were often guarded or dismissive. Some said it was best not to get involved, that prying into other people's lives could bring trouble. Others insisted that the disappearances were just coincidences, that people moved for jobs or family reasons, and that I was reading too much into it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, and that the silence surrounding it was more dangerous than the vanishings themselves. One afternoon, I met a woman named Claire at the local library. She was new, like me, and seemed just as curious about the missing neighbors. We compared notes quietly over coffee, sharing stories of empty houses, strange noises, and the rumors that circulated in whispers. Claire told me she had tried calling the homes of some neighbors who had disappeared, only to hear nothing but static or dead lines. "It's like they never existed," she said softly. "Like the neighborhood is swallowing them up." As days turned into weeks, the pattern grew clearer but no safer. More houses fell silent, more families disappeared, and the community's collective fear seemed to grow heavier but remain unspoken. I began to dread the nights, when the stillness pressed in and the shadows seemed to stir with unseen movement. The strange noises continued, soft knocks, footsteps just beyond the porch light, and once, the unmistakable sound of a child crying in the distance. But when I looked for the source, there was nothing. The neighborhood I had hoped would be a refuge was becoming a place of mystery and menace. I was caught between wanting to understand what was happening and wanting to turn away, to ignore the signs and pretend life would go back to normal. But every empty house, every piece of abandoned property, every whispered rumor pulled me deeper into a story I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of. Driven by a restless need to understand what was happening to my neighbors, I began to investigate more directly. I started visiting the houses where people had disappeared, hoping to find some clue, anything that might explain the eerie silence and sudden abandonment. It wasn't easy to do without drawing attention. I made sure to visit during the day, pretending to be a passerby admiring the neighborhood or a curious potential homebuyer, hoping that a casual demeanor would keep suspicion at bay. At the first house I approached, the Hendersons, the front door was cracked open just enough to slip inside. The air was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of lavender and dust. Inside, the living room looked as if the family had simply stepped out. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the table, a jacket was draped over a chair, and the television was paused on a late-night talk show. But the silence was absolute, oppressive even. I called out softly, but only the echo of my own voice answered. An uneasy feeling settled in my chest as I took a few cautious steps further. The house felt empty, but not empty in the way a vacant home might feel. It was more like the space was holding its breath, waiting for something to return. At another home, the Parkers, I found a plate of food sitting on the kitchen counter, cold and untouched. The sink was full of dirty dishes, and a child's drawing lay crumpled on the floor. It was surreal, like stepping into a scene frozen in time. I tried calling the Parkers' phone number, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent messages on social media, but there was no response. It was as if the family had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only these haunting remnants of everyday life. One evening, while walking past the Lewis house, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. I stopped and looked toward the window, where I thought I saw a figure standing in the shadows. My heart pounded as I squinted, but when I blinked, the figure was gone. I told myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But the feeling that I wasn't alone persisted, a cold prickling at the back of my neck that wouldn't let go. That night, I decided to take a closer look at the house. I circled around to the backyard, where the garden gate was slightly ajar. The yard was overgrown, and the swing set creaked softly in the breeze. I heard footsteps behind me, quick and light, but when I turned, there was no one there. A shiver ran down my spine as I hurried back to the front, locking the door behind me once I was inside. The sense of being watched lingered long after the door was shut. I tried bringing these incidents to local authorities, hoping someone would take the disappearances seriously. But each time, I was met with vague reassurances and gentle dismissals. The police officer I spoke to seemed sympathetic, but said there were no missing persons reports filed for any of the neighbors I mentioned. "We can't investigate unless there's evidence of foul play or a formal complaint," he told me. "People move all the time, especially in small towns. It's probably nothing." I left the station feeling frustrated and isolated, as if the town itself was conspiring to keep the truth hidden. One night, as I sat in my living room reviewing my notes and photos, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It read simply, "Stop looking." My heart jumped, and I scanned the room, half expecting to see someone standing there in the shadows. The message was chilling in its brevity and implied threat. I didn't reply. Instead, I locked the doors and windows and pulled the curtains tight, trying to convince myself it was just a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I decided to visit the community center, hoping to find someone willing to talk openly about the disappearances. Inside, the weekly bingo game was in full swing, the room filled with laughter and chatter. I struck up a conversation with a woman named Ellen, who seemed friendly but cautious. When I mentioned the missing neighbors, her smile faltered. "You don't want to go digging," she said quietly. "There are things better left alone in this town." I pressed her for more, but she just shook her head and excused herself. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Walking home from a late shift at the grocery store, I took a detour through a dimly lit alley. I felt eyes on me, and when I glanced back, I saw a shadowy figure disappear around the corner. I followed at a distance, heart pounding, but the figure vanished before I could catch up. When I reached my street, I found my front porch light flickering, though I was sure I had left it on. Inside the house, a cold draft brushed past me, and the faint sound of whispering seemed to come from the walls themselves. Determined to understand what was happening, I returned to the vanished neighbors' homes, this time carrying a small voice recorder and a flashlight. At the Hendersons, I sat in the dark living room and recorded the silence, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood. Suddenly, a soft tapping began at the back door. 3 quick knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. I froze, heart hammering, and called out, but no one answered. When I opened the door, there was nothing but the empty yard bathed in moonlight. At the Parkers' house, I found an old rotary phone on a side table. It was disconnected, the cord frayed and worn. Yet, as I sat there, the phone began to ring, shrill and insistent. I jumped up, startled, but when I picked it up, there was only static. The ringing stopped abruptly, and the house was silent again. I wanted to leave immediately, but something held me there, a morbid curiosity mixed with dread. One night, as I was leaving a neighbor's home I'd been investigating, I caught a glimpse of shadowy figures near the edge of the property. They moved just beyond the reach of the porch light, tall, indistinct shapes that seemed to watch me. I blinked, and they were gone. The sighting confirmed my worst fears. Whatever was happening in this neighborhood was far from natural. I realized I was in deeper than I wanted to be, but I couldn't turn back now. The mystery had wrapped itself around me, pulling me into a web of silence and shadows. With every unanswered question, every vanished face, the threat grew more tangible. I was alone in this, and the town's quiet complicity made me feel even more vulnerable. The days blended into nights, each filled with a mounting sense of danger. I kept my doors locked and my blinds drawn, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every creak, every whisper of wind, set my nerves on edge. I wanted to warn others, but who would believe me? Who would even listen? The disappearances were no longer just a mystery, they were a warning. And I was dangerously close to becoming the next chapter in this silent story. The sense of menace that had been lurking just beneath the surface finally erupted into something unmistakable one night. It started with a knock on my front door, soft but insistent, like someone testing to see if I was home. I froze, heart pounding, staring through the peephole into the blackness beyond. No one was there. I waited, listening, but the only sound was the distant hum of a car passing by on the main road. I locked the door tighter and double-checked all the windows before retreating to the back of the house, where I tried to calm my racing thoughts. But the uneasy feeling only grew heavier. Moments later, a shadow flickered past the living room window. I ducked behind the couch, barely daring to breathe. The silhouette lingered for a moment before disappearing into the night. The next day, I dared to tell a neighbor about what had happened. To my surprise, she didn't seem shocked. "You've seen it now," she said in a low voice. "They don't like people poking around." Her expression was grim, and I realized I wasn't the only one who had felt the invisible pressure to stay silent. She warned me to stop looking into the disappearances, telling me that some things were better left alone for my own safety. That evening, as I sat staring at my phone, another message appeared on the screen. No number, just the words, "Stop digging or you'll be next." The cold dread that washed over me was unlike anything I'd felt before. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned off my phone and sat in the dark, listening for any sound that might signal an intrusion. The following days were a blur of anxiety and restless nights. Every creak in the house, every flicker of a shadow outside, felt like a threat. I avoided going out after dark and kept the blinds drawn tight. Yet, despite my precautions, the feeling that I was being watched never left me. It was as if invisible eyes were tracking my every move, waiting for me to slip up. One night, I returned home late after a long day and found my front door slightly ajar. Panic surged through me as I stepped inside, heart hammering. The house was cold and quiet, but signs of intrusion were clear. Drawers left open, a lamp knocked over, and muddy footprints on the floor. Whoever had entered had been looking for something, or perhaps just trying to intimidate me. I called the police, but their response was frustratingly slow and unhelpful. They dusted for prints and found nothing conclusive. Their parting words were a vague warning to be careful and report anything else unusual. I realized then that I was on my own. The tension reached a breaking point when, one evening, I found myself trapped inside a neighbor's empty house. I'd gone there to check for signs of life, hoping to gather more clues, but the door slammed shut behind me as I stepped inside. The windows were barred, and the locks had mysteriously engaged. I pounded on the door and shouted, but no one answered. Trapped in the dark, I felt a suffocating presence pressing in around me. The air grew heavy, and faint whispers echoed through the rooms. Panic surged as I searched for a way out, finally managing to wedge open a small basement window and crawl through. I stumbled into the cool night air, gasping for breath, and ran all the way home without looking back. That same night, I received an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Leave now, or you won't leave at all." The threat was clear, and fear took hold like a vice. Faced with mounting danger and isolation, I made the difficult decision to leave the neighborhood immediately. Packing was a blur of hurried movements and frantic thoughts. I broke my lease, forfeited my deposit, and arranged for a friend to help me move my belongings. The emotional cost was high, but the alternative, staying and risking whatever force was behind the disappearances, was unthinkable. As I drove away from the place I had hoped to call home, I glanced back at the fading silhouette of the neighborhood. Empty houses stood like tombstones, silent witnesses to the vanished lives that had once filled them. The weight of the unresolved mystery clung to me, a shadow I couldn't shake. Though I was relieved to be leaving, a part of me remained haunted by the unanswered questions. What had taken my neighbors? What force had turned this once friendly neighborhood into a place of fear and disappearance? And most unsettling of all, had I truly escaped, or was I carrying a piece of that darkness with me? I chose not to reach out to anyone else from the neighborhood after I left, wanting to distance myself from the nightmare I'd escaped. But a few weeks later, I received a message from the new tenant who had moved into my old house. Kayla wrote about strange noises at night, knocks on the glass door, whispers in the dark, and the same creeping feeling of being watched. I didn't respond. Some things, I decided, were better left alone. After leaving the neighborhood, I hoped to find some semblance of normalcy in a new town far from the shadows I'd fled. I settled into a small apartment in a bustling suburb, where the streets were alive with the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting across fences. The contrast was stark, and for a while, I allowed myself to believe that the nightmare was behind me, buried beneath miles of distance and time. But the memories clung stubbornly to my mind. At night, I'd lie awake, haunted by the empty houses and vanished faces, the whispered warnings and shadowy figures that had stalked my days and nights. The silence that had filled that neighborhood wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence all its own, a reminder of something terrible lurking just beyond sight. I began to hear reports from friends and acquaintances about similar disappearances happening elsewhere. Small towns and quiet suburbs, places much like the one I had left behind, were suddenly marked by unsettling patterns. Families gone without a trace, unexplained noises, and neighbors too afraid to speak. Each story echoed the one I'd lived, reinforcing the terrifying thought that this was no isolated phenomenon. Despite the fear that tightened in my chest with each new report, I found myself unable to turn away. The questions gnawed at me relentlessly. What was causing these vanishings? Was it some malevolent force spreading through these communities? And if so, was it only a matter of time before it found me again, no matter where I went? I wrestled with the urge to dig deeper, to seek out answers that might explain the darkness I'd escaped. But caution held me back. The warnings I'd received were not idle threats. Some mysteries, I realized, carried a price too high to pay. I chose instead to live cautiously, keeping my distance from anything that resembled the silent streets and empty homes of my past. In the quiet moments, I often reflected on the fragility of community, the way a neighborhood can appear safe and welcoming one day, then unravel into something unrecognizable the next. I thought about the neighbors I'd known, the ones who had smiled and waved, and the ones who had vanished without a trace. Their stories remained unfinished, their fates unknown. The experience changed me, leaving scars that no distance could heal. I became wary of silence, suspicious of empty houses, and hesitant to trust the calm that sometimes settles over a place. The world I once knew had shifted, revealing a darker underside that few dared to acknowledge. Now, I live with the knowledge that some mysteries remain forever unsolved, and some dangers lurk just beyond the edges of our perception. The vanished neighbors and the silent streets are a haunting reminder that safety can be fragile, and that sometimes the most unsettling truths are the ones we choose not to see.